Did you know that every single piece of plastic that has ever been made is still around today?
That's crazy! Can you imagine the entire world covered in plastic? So let's be thankful for the recycling and composting system. Hey, this is Nee.
And Anna! Today we're going to take a look at Rachel Carson and the environmental movement. Woo!
So let's go back to the beginning of the 60s when the environment was not an important concern for many Americans until Rachel Carson, an author and environmental activist who wrote a book that changed the world called Silent Spring. So Carson was born on May 27th, 1907 in Springdale, Pennsylvania. From an early age, Carson aspired to be a writer, but in college, she switched her major from English to biology. She earned a master's degree in zoology from Johns Hopkins University in 1932. She was a biologist with the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries, later called the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. She wrote and edited many informational materials for the public. So we can say that this led to her lifelong love for the environment and animals. Carson wrote multiple books, such as Under the Sea Wind, published in 1941. Her second book, The Sea Around Us, was a fantastic success. It remained in the bestseller list for a record of 86 weeks. Carson's books focused on a problem that had concerned her for at least a decade: the use and abuse of dangerous new chemicals in agriculture and pest control. And that is why Silent Springs was written.
So what made Silent Spring different from other books? First, Rachel Carson was a famous writer in the 1950s. Secondly, the quality of her writing was phenomenal, and she made complex science understandable to the general public. Lastly, a series of environmental disasters in the 60s and 70s impacted the American public's view on the environment, and which made them even more concerned about the way they were treating the earth. There were still critics that called her book inaccurate and exaggerated, but they could never name specific examples of her error.
The book raised public awareness about invisible chemical poisons in their food, and most importantly, it encouraged the government to revise the regulations of chemicals. The Nixon administration established the Environmental Protection Agency, also known as EPA, in 1970 to give it authority to enforce regulations and to protect human health and the environment. The success of the first Earth Day in April 22nd of 1970 put tremendous pressure for the politicians to do something about environmental catastrophes. An estimated 20 million people participate across the country in what will ultimately be the largest demonstration ever in American history. The Toxic Substances Control Act of 1976 was the Silent Springs' greatest achievement. The EPA banned or severely restricted all 6 compounds mentioned in Silent Spring, such as DDT and all of the stuff that you do not want in your food.
Environmental awareness became even more influential when Dr. Seuss wrote a book published in 1971 called The Lorax. The Lorax was a children's book, but also a cautionary tale of what could happen if the human race consumes too much too fast and doesn't let any ecosystems regenerate. There must always be a balance between nature and humankind. Here's a short video about Rachel discussing the balance of nature.
Ms. Carson maintains that the balance of nature is a major force in the survival of man, whereas the modern chemist, the modern biologist, the modern scientist believes that man is steadily controlling nature.
Now, to these people, apparently the balance of nature was something that was repealed as soon as man came on the scene. Well, you might just as well assume that you could repeal the law of gravity. The balance of nature is built of a series of interrelationships between living things and between living things and their environment.
The Silent Spring slowly entered popular culture with its message about the environment. Carson's appear across many television shows and magazines, those that educate public about bioconcentration of chemicals in fishes and other environmental issues. And soon enough, she had become a cultural icon. Many artists, musicians, poets, writers were inspired by her. Rachel Carson was a powerful influence that left a profound impact on the environment movement, as well as receiving admiration and support from scientists, policymakers, activists, as well as the general public. She also advocated women's empowerment by challenging society's typical gender roles that women would not be able to change the world.
Here's a fun fact. At the height of the Cold War, many said she was probably a communist because the demand to eliminate pesticides might reduce the food supply to the east of the Iron Curtain. Silent Spring was the earliest and greatest impact on the environmental movement. It sold hundreds and thousands of copies and stayed at the bestseller list for 31 months when it was first published in September of 1962, later becoming an international bestseller and available in many languages. Today, half a century later, Silent Spring continues to outrage many conservatives, but also inspires environmentalists and many more to take action to protect our environment for future generations. Rachel Carson passed away on April 14th of 1964 due to breast cancer, but not without leaving a legacy behind that transforms the way our society thinks about the environment.